Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this event of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. My name is Wendy Weiser. I direct the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center, and for those of you who don't know us, we're a nonpartisan think tank and public interest law center that works to reform, revitalize, and defend the systems of democracy and justice. And today we're going to talk about one really important such system, the U.S. Census. We can keep track of our work online at brennancenter.org, following us on Facebook and Twitter, and watching our videos on YouTube. And this event is being recorded as well. I am pleased and honored to be joined with some of our nation's leading experts on civil rights and the census, also thankful of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights for co-sponsoring this event. So why are we here to talk about the census? The Constitution requires every 10 years for the government to count each and every person in the United States. And that official count of the population of the United States is called the census, and it is fast approaching. So why do we care about the census? Is this a boring or technical topic? Well, it turns out that the census matters a whole lot to a whole lot of other things that we care deeply about. It affects how political power is allocated across the country and within states. It affects how billions of dollars of federal funds are distributed, from Medicaid to food stamps to a whole bunch of other programs. It affects local government decisions about everything from public health to where schools are located. It affects business decisions about investments, where to site offices, hiring. It really affects just about everything. It is a massive project. It costs billions of dollars, involves tens of thousands of workers across the country, and it takes multiple years in preparation and planning. And now we're only 2 years out from the census, and so that preparation and planning is already underway. And we're here to talk about how this is going and why we care about it. And I am very pleased to introduce my co-panelists here. To my immediate left is Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. To his left, Vanita Gupta, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and Joseph Salvo, Director of the Population Division of the New York City Department of Planning. So welcome. Before we begin, I do want to say we are going to have time at the end for questions and answers, so please, I will open it up and there will be microphones as well. So before we get going on what's going on with the census this year and any of the problems, I want to invite each of the panelists to just briefly talk about what's at stake. Your organizations and entities have worked on the census for decades, long before there was a Trump administration. So why do you care about the census? And I'll start with you, Vanita. Why is this something that the civil rights community cares about?
So thank you, and I'm really pleased to be here, especially at my alma mater, which I have such great fond memories of, and to be here with key partners in the fight for our democracy and for justice, and really great to see everyone. So I will confess, I've been a lifelong civil rights lawyer, and the census is probably one of the least sexy issues that I have confronted. So I'm actually also excited that all of you are in the room, because you probably much earlier than I understood really kind of what is at stake with the census. As Wendy said, the census touches every aspect of our country. And it isn't just that it touches the enforcement of civil rights, which it does on almost virtually every issue that you care about, and employment, voting rights, disability discrimination, but also to all of the marketing research that corporate America depends on. And I would say right now that the fight for a fair and accurate census is actually, and I'm not putting this I'm not exaggerating, is truly a fight to save our democracy. And there are some key and unique threats that are being presented for our ability to have a fair and accurate 2020 census. And if we don't, I mean, the consequences of the census, we have one chance to get this right. The consequences of it last a full decade. They impact, as Wendy said, political and economic power across communities in the country. And so to me right now, there are some key buckets of threats that I would just isolate out, and I know that Tom and Joe are going to be speaking a little bit more about them. One is funding, and the funding of the census. The 2020 census has been chronically underfunded at a scale unforeseen in prior census cycles. We were very happy, the Leadership Conference and our partners worked very hard to get the FY18 budget levels to the amount that it needed to be, but we're now, again, in a fight to have FY19 budget levels increase. Why? Why do we care about the funding? The funding for the Census Bureau that was at stake hit and touched two key areas of the Census Bureau's work. One was the partnership programs that it runs. The Census Bureau depends on trusted messengers in local communities in almost every community in the country to literally go knocking on doors. There's usually around 7 times that the Census Bureau will attempt contact with a person. And this time, it is the first digital census. There's an internet option for the first time for everyone, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But the partnership program is vitally important. I think even before the citizenship question, before Secretary Ross added the citizenship question, which I will also talk about, there's a level of fear among certain communities, namely immigrant communities right now, given the distinctly anti-immigrant agenda that is being promoted out of the Trump administration. And once the citizenship question got added, those levels of fear, I think, around people's feeling safe in responding to the census has been escalated. And yet, there isn't an option to kind of desist from responding. That will not result in the kind of fair and accurate count, and ultimately will result in harming our communities. There is this funding level to get that infrastructure out there. Also, the Census Bureau ends up hiring about 500,000 short-term employees to help do this work, and so there's a whole infrastructure for that. And there's a communications campaign effort that the Census Bureau runs every time that funding is sorely needed for, in order to get the word out. Why should communities be counted? Remember that the Constitution, this is one of the only constitutionally mandated government programs. It's written into the enumeration clause in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that every single person, regardless of status or background, must be counted every 10 years in this country. And so in order to do that and to accommodate the fact that every decennial census cycle, there are always hard to count communities, and they are exactly the communities that you would imagine: immigrant communities, African American communities, young folks, mobile folks. That this particular, in this political climate, there is an additional level of fear that these communications and partnership programs need to be able to help overcome. So that's one bucket. Another bucket is the digital piece and the fact that this is an online census. There's a lot of concern around hacking, whether there's enough secure infrastructure, a concern about the influence of the dark web, and I'm sure that we'll talk about that as well. And then the third bucket is one that has been in the news quite a fair bit. And that is that in December of 2017, Attorney General Jeff Sessions asked Secretary Ross of the Commerce Department to add a citizenship question, allegedly to advance voting rights enforcement of the Voting Rights Act in the Justice Department. Many of us had views on kind of in hearing that was the rationale that was offered on exactly kind of for us laid bare a different agenda and a concern about what was really animating this. Secretary Ross did stakeholder outreach, reached out to some of us that spoke to him directly, also as the former head of the Civil Rights Division who had overseen Voting Rights Act enforcement for almost 2.5 years. Know very well that not since the enactment of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 has the Justice Department ever depended on this data. And we've always relied, the Justice Department's always relied on the estimates obtained from the American Community Survey, which goes out to a sampling of households, about 5% of households. It's been more than adequate to ensure rigorous enforcement. And in late March, Secretary Ross decided indeed to add that question. It was a week after the Trump campaign had sent out a fundraising email kind of goading the answer in this direction. And I'll just close by the concern that we are confronting right now, not only as a civil rights community, but as a broader community about what it should be a nonpartisan endeavor in this country, is that the census is being weaponized for political purposes. And that is what we are kind of really confronting now, and there's a lot of advocacy and litigation, which I can talk about later, that's happening.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Vanita. And there are a lot of topics that we're going to touch on, and it will go in great length, especially about the citizenship question. From kind of 10,000-foot level, Tom, why is it that it matters that people actually participate in the census? What's at stake for the Latino community and for others as well?
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to the Brennan Center for including me on this panel. This is MALDEF's 50th anniversary this year in 2018, and almost since the beginning of our existence, we have focused on census outreach and census count because of all the reasons that you've detailed. First and foremost, it's important to get as complete a count as possible of the Latino community to ensure that political power begins to match up with the population growth. So, for example, after the last census, the state of Texas was the big winner in reapportionment of the House of Representatives, gaining 4 congressional seats. Well, we had to go to court to get the Texas legislature to ensure that those seats went where the population that earned them was. We did ultimately ensure that 2 of those new congressional districts in Texas were majority-minority seats, and that's important to increase the political power of the Latino community in Texas to begin to get close to matching its growth. You've also pointed out that important resources go out to communities based on these counts, and that's critical to all communities, but to the Latino community as the largest minority group in the country, because so many of those government resources are important to providing the ability to grow, the ability to engage, the ability to ensure that involvement matches the growth of the population. So census is critical to all of those different things, why it's so important that we get a complete count. But the last thing I'll say is it's not just the total count of the Latino population, it's getting the count right demographic by demographic. So for example, if we see an undercount of those who are young, that's going to have particular impacts. If we see an undercount of those who are elderly, that's going to have a particular impact. And that's one of the major concerns about the citizenship question. If an entire household fails to report, it will mean that the Census Bureau sends an enumerator to the field to approach that household and attempt to get the data. However, if a household fills out the form but chooses to leave out certain members of the household, the Bureau is not well equipped to identify that as a potential undercount and then take steps to fill in the blanks. So for example, in the last census, our colleagues at NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, has done some important work to point out that lots and lots of infants, 2 years and younger, were left out of reports by households. That has particular impacts on resources that are directed at that age cohort. With the citizenship question, the danger is not so much that entire households fail to report, but that they leave certain people out. Folks in the household who may have immigration status issues, citizenship concerns, might be left out. And that could, particularly, for example, affect the elderly in the Latino, Asian American, and other populations. And that could have a devastating impact on resources directed at that particular demographic. So we've got to understand that the danger of the undercount is not just entire households not reporting, but if we somehow lead households to report, but leave out particularly important members of their household.
Thank you. Joe, I'd like to bring you in now to talk a little bit about the impact of all this in New York. You've been involved in multiple censuses. You know how the census works and is used in New York City. So why does it matter, and why don't we want to see an undercount here?
Well, let me begin by saying that a few days ago, our department put up a new application called New York City Population Fact Finder. And imagine a bunch of you in the audience know this has happened. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to study parts of the city in any configuration you want. You can put together census tracts, neighborhoods, and come up with a profile of the current population, where we've been in the past, change over time. All of that entire system is built upon the integrity of census data. And I want everyone to remember that ACS leans on the census big time. The fact of the matter is that the census is a direct input into the American Community Survey. If there's a shortage of children in the census, it will show up in the American Community Survey. So we put the data out there for the libraries, for our different departments, the health department, studying disease incidence among children. And I want to mention something that happened in 2010. In 2010, in Astoria and the kind of the southern tier of Brooklyn, the Census Bureau really kind of messed up the data. And how did they do this? They said essentially that there were an abundance of units in these neighborhoods that were vacant. Okay, something went wrong in the census operation. Every census has its problems. We identified the problem. Why did we identify it? It was because the health department uses data in those neighborhoods in order to calculate rates so that they can figure out whether there's a health issue or not, whether there's a health crisis. If those numbers are off, it can trigger the expenditure of resources for something that perhaps doesn't even exist because too few people were in the bottom of the denominator of the calculation of that rate. That is just one example. More, perhaps, the libraries of the city come to us on a fairly regular basis to help them anticipate what to do with their holdings. Why? Because the libraries are on the front lines of acculturation, you know, the fact that people come in, immigrants, and where else to go than to get to know your new home than to the public libraries. They're free. You can go into a library and you can explore and learn and get resources and services. I can go on and on, you know, for the next half hour on all of the applications that we see in my office every day. If the numbers are not right, that has real consequences for us. Real consequences. And I want to address something that was just said, which is really important. Right now in my office, we are essentially helping the Census Bureau build the address list for the 2020 census. We got a file about 2 months ago with 3.6 million records, every single exact address in New York City, and we have 120 days to get back to the Census Bureau regarding the accuracy of this list. The truth is we've been working on it about 2 years, you know, so far, and we're helping the Bureau build a foundation. We want all the addresses to make it into the census. We have been going out in the field to verify, and we're encountering pushback. We're encountering people who are petrified of our presence. And we're New York City. We have a mayor who's outspoken in his support of immigration. And we still have that fear that is occurring in our neighborhoods. So now we're building that address list. What was said earlier was we want to make sure that address list is the foundation of the census. If you don't have a valid address, you don't get enumerated. So we have all the addresses in. Now we need to support efforts to get the people, everyone in those households, to respond. And I like to use this analogy. The address list is to the decennial census. Like I said, the foundation. Response. We need to lean on the fact that there is a law in this country. We are a country of laws, and there is a law in this country. Title 13 protects the confidentiality of census responses. Confidentiality cannot be used against you, the information on the census questionnaire. It's interesting. It would take another law. I'm not the lawyer here, by the way. Excuse me. I just want to make sure that let me get that straight. And tell me if I'm wrong on this, okay?
We have 3 lawyers that can
the
correct him.
fact is, though, it would take another law to overturn this one, okay? So we have this law that's out there, and it protects confidentiality census responses. So how do we undermine the census? What we do is we make people afraid. We scare them. We scare not only the undocumented, but we scare everybody else in the family. Okay? 1 million+ people in New York City alone. And we get them afraid that somehow the deal that is inherent, the promise that is inherent in Title 13, no longer applies. So what in effect you've done is you've rescinded a law and its protections. That's what scares me. Okay? That idea that somehow people will no longer believe that our laws matter. Okay? So I'll leave it up to the lawyers, though, to follow up on this. But I think that this is the true crisis we're facing right now, because as I like to say, The people who are citizens, those children across the dinner table, sitting with the uncle who's a legal permanent resident, sitting with the cousin who's the undocumented immigrant, they all have in common the fear that is being generated around the census. And that is should be our biggest concern, allaying those fears and getting people to stand up for who they are. Because our data rely on it, and data have real consequences. I'll leave you with this idea. Simply put, people come to me all the time, they say, your numbers are too low, your numbers are too low, our community's much bigger. And I keep saying to them, you need to answer, you need to show up, you need to put yourself into the statistical system, because if you're not, it's like you don't exist, at least in our data, and data matter.
Well, so there's a lot in that, and I want to pick up on the point that people are mistrusting the census. And one of the main generators of this mistrust is something that we've already heard about, the decision by Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross to call for a citizenship question to be added to the census. And in response to that, Tom, you and MALDEF have called for his resignation. So I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about what's wrong with that? Why is that such a bad thing? Why that warrants such a big outcome, and how worried we should be?
Well, first, as of last week, although we haven't publicly announced it yet, the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, which is a coalition of 45 of the most important national Latino civil rights organizations, has joined the call for Wilbur Ross to resign as Commerce Secretary. And the basic reason is he has failed in his primary responsibility with respect to the census, and that is to prevent its politicization. By making a decision this late in the process, without adequate testing, to add a citizenship question, he has elevated the political aims of the Trump administration over the accuracy of the census, and in our view, that renders him disqualified to continue to serve as Commerce Secretary. He had one responsibility, which was to keep politics out of the census, and he couldn't do that. That lack of integrity, in our view, means that he's not competent to serve in the capacity that he has. He approved a citizenship question that was requested late in the process. The Census Bureau is already well into its decade-long planning and testing of wording of questions, specific questions to be added, how to go about using technology. They've been doing this throughout the decade since the data from the last census was revealed. And that planning has been upended by the addition of this question very late in the process, so late, in fact, that they couldn't even include it in the end-to-end test this year that is the last test that the Bureau uses before going into the actual census. So purely from the standpoint of putting together a successful census, this departs from any process ever used. It is clearly going to be damaging to the census, no matter what the question might be added this late in the game. But the question being asked is a controversial one, and one designed, I believe, to reduce the Latino count. And you can imagine why. Donald Trump has his little thumbs poised to put out the tweet when the census comes back with an undercount of Latinos lower than expected, because his tweet will say that that lower than expected count of the Latino population is entirely a result of his immigration policies, and he will use that to build up more support in his increasingly limited political base. But that is what this is about. It's not about getting accurate data. It's not about using data for voting rights enforcement, as Vanita indicated. We have, for 53 years, since the Voting Rights Act was first put in place, enforced the Voting Rights Act without decennial census citizenship data. We've used sample data and used it successfully. There is no reason that we have to include this question for reasons of voting rights or other. It is really about ensuring that there is an undercount, and the best response to that is what we've all talked about, which is folks knowing their rights, knowing the law, believing and understanding that law will not be violated because folks will not allow it to be violated. As you've just heard, there is statutory protection on the confidentiality of census data. It cannot be released for 72 years. It cannot be used for any purpose other than collecting aggregate data about the country and parts of the country. But beyond that statute, there's a constitutional basis. So even if the Congress were to go crazy, or crazier, depending on your perspective, and try to repeal that law, there's a constitutional basis for the census and then a constitutional basis to ensure confidentiality so people will actually participate in the census. So this is not just a statute. There's constitutional protections on confidentiality. But the truth is, we're never going to build trust in the Trump administration. We've got to build trust in the Constitution, in the laws, and in folks outside of government, including folks in this room, to step in heavy and hard if there's any threat to confidentiality. I believe we can do that. I believe, in fact, that Donald Trump may have handed us our best get counted slogan, which is Donald Trump doesn't want you counted, make sure you're counted. And that will work for lots and lots of folks, I believe and hope, if we ensure they have confidence that those laws and constitutional protections on confidentiality are sacrosanct.
And keeping with the politicization of the census, the Commerce Department isn't the only department that was responsible for bringing about this really bad outcome. In fact, as many of you likely know, the addition of the Citizenship Question was prompted by the Department of Justice asking for that to be added, and in particular, at least if the reporting is correct, by the current head of the Civil Rights Division, John Gore, saying that this is necessary for the enforcement of our voting rights laws. And so I'm going to turn this over now to Vanita. You headed up this Civil Rights Division, whose mission it is to be the chief enforcers of our nation's civil rights laws, and presided over a period of expansion of those protections. And I was hoping you can both reflect on what it's like to see a retrenchment from that mission, having the Civil Rights Division being the driver of this effort that might be harmful to civil rights. And is this appropriate? Is this politicized? How did that come about? And maybe if you can also reflect about that justification that you started talking about, like, is this necessary or helpful for our civil rights enforcement?
So, and I think Tom kind of hit it on the head here, but when there's a couple of things wrong with Jeff Sessions asking for data to enforce the Voting Rights Act more vigorously. And some of you, I mean, I've not been very shy about kind of the rollbacks that are happening at the Civil Rights Division under Jeff Sessions. And so I think that we just all have to accept that for what it is. But mind you, there's also been a couple of other documents that are important to understand what the agenda is that is motivating, that has been behind this. One is that Kris Kobach has also admitted that he raised this issue around the opportunity of adding a citizenship question when he met privately with President Trump before the president came into the White House after he had been elected. And as you guys probably all know, Kris Kobach has had a fairly decidedly anti-immigrant agenda and has kind of allowed that to bleed in a range of different areas, including voting rights. And so the ask came when ProPublica did a very thorough investigation, FOIAs of the emails that were exchanged around the addition of this question at the Justice Department. Uncovered that John Gore, who's the acting, had signed the letter, but had done so at the request and with coordination of the leadership offices, which is the only way something this big would ever happen. And what that means is that that is decided at the highest levels of the Justice Department. It means that the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General and the Associate Attorney General presumably signed off on this and had actually kind of encouraged it. So I just think we have to assume that this request came from the highest level, and it was something that Secretary Ross repeated over and over again as the reason why he had been considering this question at all. The other piece is that, as Tom said it, I mean, the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965, was dealt a very severe blow by the United States Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision in 2013. But even outside of that, the Justice Department and across administrations has been able to vigorously enforce the Voting Rights Act, and so this justification just is not right. When people say, well, but the question is on the American Community Survey, this is like, I want to explain because I don't want to assume that people understand the difference. So the census goes out every 10 years, a short form of the census. It's about 10 questions that goes to every single household in the country. And that is what the lead up is in 2020 to to getting the census answered by April 1st, 2020. But on a monthly basis, the Census Bureau sends out a longer form to a sampling of households around the country on it's an economic survey. There's surveys on demographic data, on a range of different things, and it's a much longer form going out to a sampling of households. And that is the sampling, that's the basis for the data that not only Voting Rights Act enforcement has depended on, but actually many of the statutes that are civil rights statutes that are enforced by the Justice Department. And so that has always been, as Tom said, it's been more than adequate. I think it's really important to understand that the litigation that's been filed, and many of you may have seen that in the aftermath of the announcement by Secretary Ross that night, the California State Attorney General filed a lawsuit, and then about a week later, the New York State Attorney General with 17 other states' attorneys general and the bipartisan U.S. Conference of Mayors filed a lawsuit. And the basis for those are both a constitutional issue, that the addition of this question violates the Constitution's mandate to count every single person, regardless of background, but also a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs the very robust kind of protocols that the Census Bureau typically does when considering the addition of a question. Typically, the Census Bureau will spend about 3 years testing a question, down to the wording of the question, to the placement of where it'll appear on the form. And when Secretary Ross announced his decision with a 7-page letter, he kept saying, well, nobody told me that nobody was able to give me any data to show that it would depress participation, and therefore, in the absence of that data, I'm gonna go forward. And yet that is precisely what the Census Bureau's responsibility is to test for that, to understand what the impact would be of the addition of a question. And so to place it on outside stakeholders is actually kind of backwards on that. But I will go back to something that I think Tom said, which is important. It's why the Brennan Center and MALDEF and the Leadership Conference and all the coalition groups that are a part of this care so much, is that we can't let this politicization kind of undermine our democracy. Right now we are seeing a threat to the rule of law in our democratic institutions on so many fronts, and this attack on the census is part and parcel of that. Frankly, I think a lot of local elected officials, Republican and Democratic, are very concerned about the addition of this question because as mayors, I've been speaking to a lot of mayors, they have to provide social services, policing, municipal services, to the human beings that are in their jurisdictions, regardless of their immigration status, despite kind of what some of the administration is saying now. And they know that they will lose money to be able to provide those services if there's a failed census or an undercount. And so it is on all of us, both through litigation to stop this, where there's a threat to confidentiality, to figure out where those opportunities are, but also I think organizing. I mean, in the absence of, the leadership conferences typically worked in partnership with the Census Bureau to do the local organizing, to get out trusted messengers, to build that infrastructure with our coalition groups. And we have to put it upon ourselves that much more this time to do that work. We've been getting incoming, as Joe said, from immigrants' rights groups saying, well, should we boycott the census? That is against the law. It is against the law to boycott the census. And if somebody is advocating for that, while the Justice Department has not in the past sought to prosecute people or organizations for doing that, we have to be very, very careful to protect our organizations and people from being careful about not advocating for a criminal violation. And at the end of the day, this census is so vitally important that we do need an all-hands-on-deck effort to protect it. And there are a lot of different tools and tactics to do that. But because of how germane it is to so much of what we do in our lives, we have to do everything we can to secure it.
And I wanted to pick up on the question of the depressing participation. We've heard a lot about not only how the citizenship question, but some of these other challenges are likely to depress participation in the census, increasing the undercount. But the census has never been 100% accurate. There have always been undercounts. Here in New York City alone, we've seen undercounts of as much as 3%, I believe you, Joe, have reported before. How much of an impact do we expect to see, either because of the citizenship question or the range of other challenges and changes facing the census? Like, what's different now? How is it going to affect not just New York, but you know, how does the scientific community think this is going to impact the overall census?
If we want a little bit of a framework, what you mentioned before, if you go back to 1990, which is considered by many to be a failed census of sorts, the undercount in New York City was about 244,000, about 3% of the population. The 2000 census and the 2010 census had their problems. But because of the better address lists that we've worked on over the years, the undercounts were there, but let me say this. The Census Bureau's evaluations for 2000 and 2010 actually show little or no undercount in New York City, but we know better because when you look by neighborhood, you see some dramatic differences. There are some neighborhoods that were covered very, very well. One of the things I like to point out always is that the response in the Hispanic communities of New York, and in my office, we attribute a lot of this to outreach, was actually quite phenomenal in 2010. Washington Heights, north and south, led the city in terms of mail return rates. 80%, just pretty astonishing numbers. On the other hand, we have communities that are undercounted, where there is a substantial deficit in the enumeration. Now, to get to the question about what may happen, I hesitate because it could really be ugly. Serious undercounts are a real possibility. If you look at the fact that New York City has 3.2 million immigrants, the state has 4.4, New York City has 3.2 of that, and you look at the people that live in those households and you realize that we are about 60% either immigrants or the children of immigrants. The threats, the fear that we've been hearing and I spoke about earlier is very, very real. We could lose easily hundreds of thousands of people in this enumeration. We could easily surpass the failed census number of 244,000 for 1990. Now, there is a bit of a safeguard in the sense that the Census Bureau gets a list, that address list. For the most part, they have to put people in those units, okay? They can't call them all vacant. They tried once in some neighborhoods, but you know, it didn't work out. But for the most part, they have to put people in those units. Now, what was raised earlier was they don't put all the people in those units. Let me say this from a scientific standpoint. The census has no missing data, okay? The Census Bureau will use statistical procedures, which we refer to generally as imputation and substitution, to put people in housing units and to assign them characteristics. They'll use administrative records, IRS, Postal Service, a number of data sources to impute characteristics. To give you an example, in 2010, it doesn't sound like a lot, but 3% of the people in New York City were enumerated in households where there was literally no information provided. In Brooklyn, it was 4%. And there are communities in Brooklyn, East New York, Canarsie, where it was in the double digits, where you had 10, 15% of all people that had, for their entire household, imputed values, which means that the Census Bureau used an algorithm to substitute another household into the one that was missing. Something like that can happen here, certainly, with the citizenship question if people don't respond, leading to all kinds of potential distortions in the data, rendering it probably useless in many ways. But I ask this, if those people who don't want to answer the citizenship question don't have faith in Title 13 and confidentiality, are they really going to put their name and their address on that same form? All of a sudden, we've opened up this can of worms. As Anita just explained, we've opened up this can of worms where there's no end to this, possibly, and where, in effect, we could have a serious undercount and a distortion of characteristics at the same time. making our job of trying to describe New York City's neighborhoods difficult and perhaps even impossible in some cases. So that is the real danger lurking here. And we have to just be aware of that. As an avid data user, the threat is, I can tell you, is very, very real.
Wendy, can I just add, I wanted to give CUNY a shout out because I know one of our partners from CUNY has worked with the Leadership Conference to actually map out where the hardest to count communities are. It's based on data from prior census cycles. Obviously, we can't project where the depressed participation is without behavioral economists doing some of that work with us, but it's on our website, and it's a really important map that really lays out where we know there are the hardest to count communities. It's helping, I hope, cities do some of their planning as they look at addresses and the like, but there are resources out there like that.
And so I want to cover two topics before I get to the question and answer. And the first is one of the big impacts of that distortion, and the biggest political impact will be on redistricting. And so I'm going to turn to you, Tom, to talk a little bit about that. As many of you know, this morning, the U.S. Supreme Court has heard arguments in a case challenging all the legislative maps in Texas that MALDEF has been involved in as discriminatory. What you might not know, or might have just heard earlier, that the census is a big player in that lawsuit. It was the census that gave Texas the 4 congressional seats that were at issue, and that is sort of that is where all the evidence is playing out as to whether or not it's treating communities fairly. But it's not the only issue. I want to sort of tee up two issues. Another big issue in the census is who actually counts for the purpose of redistricting. From time immemorial, we have, redistricting has been done to create equal districts of all people. And there is a growing concern that that might be changing, that people might be pushing to actually equalize, not draw districts of equal people, but equal citizen voting age population. Why are we worried about that? What's the impact of that? So if you can talk a little bit about how the census plays into political power and redistricting, and what's in store in this fight.
Well, after every census, the first thing that happens is reapportionment of the 435 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. The states that grew at higher rates gain, and the states that grew at lower rates will cede some of their seats to others. Last census, the big winner was Texas with 4 additional seats, and current projections say that after this census, if we get close to a good count, then Texas will again be the big winner and will gain 3 more congressional seats. Those reapportionment of seats is based on, by Constitution, all persons. So they cannot distort how that happens, except by ensuring that there is an undercount of persons from particular communities. It seems odd that the state of Texas, so much a partner of this administration on immigration enforcement and other issues, is potentially the state most harmed by the inclusion of a citizenship question. They stand a real risk of not gaining the 3 seats that they are projected to gain, and that means that our House of Representatives will be distorted. It will not represent the total population of the country. It will instead be based on some undercount of data determining which seats go where. After reapportionment occurs, then we do redistricting within each of our states, first with Congress and state legislature and going down to the local level. That's where there is a question open about whether you can use some count other than total persons to determine how to draw seats. Now, we know the Constitution says districts have to be relatively equal in population. Indeed, at the congressional level, they have to be as equal as possible. There will only be 1 person deviation in the population of one congressional district to another in a state. But there was an attempt a few years ago to try to require that a state, the state of Texas, not coincidentally, use citizens of voting age, eligible voters, as the population to equalize district to district in drawing state legislative seats. Now, fortunately, that effort was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court, 8-0, rejecting the notion that you would be required to use something other than total population. But because the issue was not presented to them, they left undecided whether a state or other jurisdiction could decide voluntarily to use some population base other than total population. And that remains a lingering danger, though on a hopeful note, I will say that out of those 8 votes at this U.S. Supreme Court. 6 of them joined a very strong opinion by Justice Ginsburg that comes very close to saying that based on our history and practice and fairness, you really have to use total population. So whoever does this is going to buy a lawsuit, be expensive, they might ultimately lose it. But it is a lingering danger that we could revert, going back to an age at the beginning of our nation's existence when horribly, despicably, we put in writing that certain persons, namely slaves, African-American slaves, counted as only 3/5 of a person. What these folks are trying to do is to have certain folks, namely those under 18, and that's the biggest impact, but also, of course, non-citizens, count as 0/5 of a person for purposes of drawing districts at state and or local level. And that's a real danger to democracy that's close to the danger to democracy in this whole politicization of the census that has already occurred through the inclusion of a citizenship question. And I just want to end, I know you want to get to Q&A, by saying something extraordinary happened last November before the request to add a citizenship question. MALDEF sits on what's called the NAC, the National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations of the Census Bureau. In November 2017, the Census Bureau professionals came forward without request on their own to present data that you can find online, a PowerPoint presentation and report from that November 2017 NAC meeting. And what they put forward was what they characterize as an unprecedented experience of non-cooperation with the Census Bureau's ongoing activities. And if you read between the lines, because they didn't quite say it explicitly, what they believe caused that unprecedented level of non-cooperation that they're already seeing is the rhetoric, specifically the immigration enforcement rhetoric of the Trump administration. Really some very harrowing stories of folks who, when an enumerator went to their door, they didn't answer, and within minutes they were packing their bags and moving because someone knocked on the door. That's just one example. So Wilbur Ross had plenty of evidence, though not specifically related to a citizenship question, of the impact of what's already going on immigrant and immigrant-connected households across the country.
And before I go to Q&A, I just want to ask one last question. I'll direct this one to you, Vanita, which is, the fight is clearly joined. There's a lot to do. What is the Leadership Conference doing to prevent the census from going off the rails, to actually prevent this train wreck from happening?
Well, so it's not just the Leadership Conference. I mean, the Leadership Conference has been involved in the census about the last 3 decennial census cycles, and certainly the conditions right now are among the most perilous that we've seen. But there's been, as I said, a significant amount of litigation. The Lawyers Committee has also filed a lawsuit. There's likely to be other lawsuits imminently filed. I'm not giving away any secrets there, but I mean, I think that for the civil rights community, there's so much concern and fear around this. And so there's the litigation piece that many of the Leadership Conference member organizations are doing, but also a lot of work, and I think it's really important that everyone understand that as people living in communities, that each of us, each of you have a role to play. There are, as advocacy with your city and local officials, with your congressional delegations locally to stand up and use and talk about the census. In Congress right now, there are like 100 priorities, and yet this one is, as I said, and we've all said, is so vital to our democracy, that making sure that your congressional delegation, and for folks in New York who vote in New York, don't know if you know, but Chuck Schumer has a fairly big role to play as the Democratic leader, to make sure both on the funding pieces, but also on like being very assertive around the pushback. I would say also it is really important that people show up and vote in November. There won't be any kind of congressional solution to this unless people who stand for your values, or our values to save the census and for our democracy, are in office to try to undo this question. And then I think there's organizing in local communities. You all know who the trusted leaders are. The city officials know who the community leaders are, who will need to be organized to be out there to go and knocking on doors, and that's a whole setup with infrastructure. You can become part of the temporary workforce that the country depends on. There are census counts committees that form in cities around the country. If you aren't from New York, try to find out whether your hometown has a census counts committee. And come to the Leadership Conference website. We've kind of listed out a range of different ways for all of us to participate to make sure that we can have a fair and accurate count.
Thank you. And this is NYU School of Law's Brennan Center for Justice program, and we are talking with Tom Sines of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Vanita Gupta of the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, Joseph Salvo of the Population Division of the New York City Department of Planning. I'm Wendy Weiser from the Brennan Center, and we're now going to open up to questions from the audience. Please step up to the mic and tell us your name and ask a very brief one-part question, please.
Hi, I'm Michael Waldman, also from the Brennan Center. One of the factors that is new this time is that this census will be online for the most part. I wonder if you could talk about how that intersects with the fears that communities have, the worries that people have anyway about giving their information to the government, and what can be done both to protect the information but also to encourage participation given the online factor.
This is going to be the most paperless census we've ever had. 80% of households will never receive a paper questionnaire. Instead, they'll be asked to fill out a form online. And even field enumerators who go out to follow up with households that don't respond will be putting the information directly into a tablet and not onto any paper form. So all of the cybersecurity concerns that are lurking out there based on Russian hacking, based on Experian types of data breaches, raise concerns about this coming Census 2020, and those concerns need to be addressed. And I am concerned, as Vanita outlined the problems at the beginning, that the Bureau is not ahead of that issue, is not ensuring that it can provide the best assurance possible that its technological resources are state-of-the-art and protected as much as is possible to do in this day and age. And it's a real concern that the administration will not put the resources and targeting into messaging on the issue, into ensuring that assurances can be provided as much as possible about the security of the technology that's being used for the Bureau. It is an additional challenge on top of the ones that we've talked about related to the content, particularly the citizenship question, that we would face and will face in Census 2020. I think the most important thing that we can all do is recognize that we must work together to ensure that there is adequate outside protection, adequate outside folks ready to step in if there's any breach, intentional or otherwise, to prevent widespread damage from it. I don't know what else we could possibly do. The unfortunate element of this is that it's outside forces, including state and local government, including nonprofits, including leaders from every field that need to step up, because I think it's virtually impossible to build trust in the Trump administration by and large across the country.
Can I also, I think another piece that is important is that the Leadership Conference in conjunction with some other groups are also building out a table of technologists to help work with the Census Bureau to really kind of figure out how to pinpoint and resolve and do some of the kind of work and testing and research, encryption, security that we all are very concerned about. And so whether or not it's going to be enough is a question, but we can't leave this and don't feel comfortable leaving it right now given the underfunding solely to the Census Bureau. I think there is a lot of there are a lot of people out there thinking about these questions, and frankly, the government should be thinking about them more, especially in light of 2016. But this table of technologists is part of the work that we are doing to really try to get ahead of these questions and to figure it out in partnership with the Census Bureau. And I want to make clear, and this is just from having been in government, I feel sensitive to this, that the decision to add the citizenship question was also against the grain of the Census Bureau career employees who every day, day in and day out, do this work to carry out one of the most complex peacetime operations that our country carries out, and also against the 6 former census directors of Republican and Democratic administrations. And so I say that just to say that we continue to work and try to provide the kind of technical assistance and partnership with the Census Bureau to deal with some of these issues around the digital online concerns that we've talked about.
So my question's for Mr. Salvo. You have an interesting job because you're actually out in the field talking to the people who will be answering the census, and one of the big challenges for the census litigation over the citizenship question is whether the citizenship question is likely to result in an undercount. As you're going out into the field, as your people are going out into the field and talking to the community about their likelihood of answering questions, are you doing something to document, without violating Title 13, whether and to what extent it's likely that people in New York City will not be answering the census when asked?
We don't keep a tally of people along those lines, but what we do keep is a very careful record of all the properties. We have visited 4,400 blocks over the last 2 years in New York City that we have determined are at high risk to being out of the census because of address problems. A lot of those are in immigrant communities where we have subdivision of housing units. So we are indeed engaging with those communities that are the toughest along these lines, the toughest to enumerate. We've created a brochure about halfway through because we stopped in a few neighborhoods because people were really afraid. So we created a brochure in 10 languages explaining that we were from the city of New York, and this is why we were there, and so on. We also have a protocol if somebody would want to call 311, so this way we could, and I literally mean me and my deputy, we could explain to people what we were doing out there. Okay, so, and we're very careful to record all of our work because what happens is we give the Census Bureau all these extra addresses they don't have on their list. They decide whether they're going to take them or not. In about a year, we'll find out. If they don't take them, we go into a process called appeal, where we have 30 days to present evidence to an independent arbiter as to whether our addresses should be accepted or not. And this is my 3rd time around. The last 2 times we've been successful. I know what leads to success, and it's documentation of everything. And so we're very careful about that, okay? So the answer to your question is we don't really have a gauge except in general about the fears that we're seeing. But just let's hypothetically say those blocks that we're covering, they're not enumerated. There are several 100,000 people involved easily in the blocks we've covered.
Hi, my name is Liz O'Young. I'm with New York Counts 2020 and proud member and to be working with Leadership Council, and thank you for your Leadership Conference for your guidance. I have a question for all 3. For Vanita and Joe, you know, how do you draw the line between cost and discretion here and challenging something that's going to be in effect for 10 years if it was not fully funded? For instance, you talked about in 2010, enumerators will go out 7 times. If they're now funding for less than half of those enumerators, how are we as community-based people to be able to judge the process? Secondly, you know, in 2010, you know, and Joe has spoken to this before, that a partially completed census still counted. And now we're getting word that if the whole census is not completed, it may not count. So where do you draw the line between challenging something because of cost and discretion to something where you can't even rely on it because it is not, you know, credible? My question to Tom is, you know, in the 2010 census, that was a time of high immigration enforcement. And how are you going to get people to complete the census? And it was agreed that there would not be ICE enforcement during that period of time when the census was being conducted. Now, after a year and a half of unrelenting immigration enforcement, that compromise, even if you were able to get it, even if you were able to negotiate it, is not enough in this current climate to convince people to complete the census. And while you all talk about, you know, believing in Title 13,
Do you have a question?
okay, I want to know, how can you preempt disclosure of census information that they used to find Japanese Americans during World War II? How can you preempt the finding of post 9/11 immigration enforcement and sharing of census information to find Arab Muslims and South Asians? Because once the damage is done, the damage is done.
And I'm going to ask the panelists to be very brief in their response. We'll have time for one question after that, and people can ask questions after the program then.
I'll take a very quick, so just in one of your questions, I think it was the second or third question, actually an incomplete census is counted. And the question is, with the online census, if this question, the citizenship question, is supposed to be last, the Census Bureau officials tell us that the plan is that even with the digital census, that if there's one question or if it's an incomplete census, the Census Bureau will count it for purposes of enumerating that you exist and that you count. But on the rest, look, you raise really important questions, and I think there is both some litigation that has been filed and probably more to be filed, kind of preempting and seeking a court to take the census in its jurisdiction to preempt the kind of concerns around improper use of data obtained through the census. And so I think that you're going to see litigation on that front. There was also, as you referred to back in 2010, there was like a moratorium on ICE activities. I don't believe that we would see that here, but there are moves on by the Tri-Caucus in Congress to get assurances from the Department of Homeland Security and DOJ, kind of renewing the commitment to the statutory piece, but also around specific mandates around immigration enforcement around the time that the census the short form is being conducted. And so, but I will go back to what I said before, which is there's litigation, there's the role that Congress plays, but in the end also, there is the role that all of us are going to have as, and you're clearly demonstrating it already as a member of your Census Counts Committee, of local organizing and being out there to explain why this matters, and to know that there are people out there as a resource for the kinds of unlawful activities should they happen, and even kind of preemptively.
So very quickly, I would just add, in fact, there was no formal moratorium in 2010. The Obama administration would not grant a formal moratorium. In practice, it may have occurred, and it's why it's very important that the ongoing work with the Department of Homeland Security continue to occur. But with respect to actual enforcement while field enumerators are out, the best response to that is to get people to fill out the form so that no enumerator is assigned to go to their household. That's a strong message to respond early to the Census Bureau's request that you fill out a form. I would also add, and this is key, but I'm going to preface this by saying MALDIF is, of course, a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, but the earliest that data will be available from this census will be 2021. Now, that coincides with when, perhaps, there will be a different president inaugurated. So, in fact, it's possible that the Trump administration will never have access to the data that is collected in 2020. Now, to the extent that's reassuring to folks, I think we need to use that message. But the most important prophylactic is assuring people that there are outside organizations, prominent individuals, former attorneys general, for example, former presidents, who are going to pledge to step in if there is any hint of a breach of confidentiality. We've got to build trust in the outside monitors, because I don't think we can build trust in the inside administration. So all of those efforts have to work together to reassure folks and prevent the historical occurrences from recurring with this census. I'm confident there are enough people out there who would sign such a pledge, join such a movement, to say we will step in from the outside, heavy and hard, if there's any hint of a breach of confidentiality. That, and getting folks to respond early, I think is the best protection against the dangers that are out there. We've got to get that message out, however, and that's where the Complete Counts committees, that's where all of the nonprofits that have partnered over the years with the Bureau and with others in other organizations to get the word out, build the confidence, get the data in is so critically important. Again, our strongest message is Donald Trump doesn't want you counted. It's time to be counted.
And apologies to those in the audience. I see many people have questions, but we have hit the end of our time. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to say that there is a lot of work for every single person in this room, every listener on video to play a part in ensuring a fair and accurate census. The fight is just beginning now, and please do get involved. I would like you to join me in thanking our extraordinary panelists, Tom Sines, Vinita Gupta, and Joseph Silva. I'm Wendy Weiser from the Brennan Center. And thank you. Please keep track of us at brennancenter.org, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and please feel free to come up afterwards and talk if you have further questions. Thank you for joining us.